De Beers controlled between 80 and 90% of all rough diamonds mined on the planet for more than a century, and used that power not to sell a stone, but to sell an idea. The idea that love has a price, and that price is measured in carats. What you're going to understand by the end of this episode is how a single private company, founded in 1888 on a South African farm, rewrote the love rituals of 500 million people. Without an election, without a mandate, with advertising, coercion, and a cartel so efficient that the United States government spent decades trying to get a seat at the negotiating table, and even then walked away footing the bill. There's a detail in this story that most people never catch. The diamond in your engagement ring doesn't represent an ancient tradition. It represents a 1938 advertising campaign. And the company that created that campaign knew from the very beginning that it was selling manufactured scarcity. Diamonds aren't rare. They never were. That matters because what comes next isn't the story of a product. It's the story of how reality gets manufactured. If this kind of story interests you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, did you know the diamond engagement ring was invented by an ad campaign? On July 31st, 1871, two Afrikaner brothers named Diederik and Johannes de Beer sold their farm in the Orange Free State for £6,600. It was an ordinary farm called Vooruitzicht. The problem, or the fortune, depending on your point of view, was that underneath that farm, there were diamonds, not a few. A quantity that would shift the balance of power of an entire global industry. The man who understood this before anyone else was named Cecil Rhodes. He had come to South Africa to work on his brother's cotton farm. The farm failed. Rhodes stayed. And while other miners fought over scraps of land, Rhodes was buying positions, consolidating rights, and eliminating competitors with the methodical coldness of someone who wasn't playing to win a battle. He was playing to have no more opponents. In 1888, Rhodes founded De Beers Consolidated Mines, with money from the London bank N.M. Rothschild and Sons, and the backing of magnate Alfred Beit. The merger absorbed the company of his greatest rival, Barney Barnado, in a negotiation that cost Barnado a sum of money he himself described as impossible to refuse. When Cecil Rhodes died in 1902, De Beers controlled 90% of the world's diamond production. Not 60, not 70, 90. That number was no accident. It was policy. Ernest Oppenheimer understood this with surgical clarity. A German immigrant who had founded the mining company Anglo-American in partnership with American financier J.P. Morgan, Oppenheimer was elected to De Beers' board in 1926 and became chairman in 1929. He didn't need to invent the monopoly. He needed to perfect it. And the phrase that defines his philosophy was spoken in 1910, nearly 2 decades before he took command. Common sense tells us that the only way to increase the value of diamonds is to make them scarce, that is, to reduce production. Simple. Brutal, effective. The mechanism was elegant in its inhumanity. De Beers didn't sell diamonds on the open market. It sold them at events called sites, 10 per year. To buy, you had to be a site holder, a designation granted by De Beers itself. Each site holder received a small box of rough stones valued between $1 and $25 million. The price was set by De Beers. There was no negotiation, no resale in rough form. Refusing the package was technically permitted, but in practice it was commercial suicide. Anyone who dared to buy from other sources lost their access permanently. For good. When independent producers refused to enter the system, De Beers flooded the market with stones identical to theirs, driving their prices down until resistance became unsustainable. When prices fell during recessions, the company bought up the surplus and stockpiled it. When the Soviet Union discovered diamonds in Siberia in 1958, and De Beers' stock fell 25% in a single day, Oppenheimer sent representatives to Moscow. The deal they struck ensured that Soviet diamonds would be sold through De Beers channels. The most powerful rival of the Cold War became just another supplier to the cartel. But no supply control mechanism could solve the problem of demand. And by the late 1930s, demand was collapsing. The Great Depression had destroyed the luxury market. American engagement rings featured colored stones, pearls, or simply nothing at all. The diamonds reaching the market were cheap, small, and without prestige, averaging $80 per stone. The volume of carats sold in the United States had fallen 50% since 1919. And European markets were even worse. The tradition of the diamond engagement ring barely existed in Germany, Austria, Italy, or Spain. In England and France, it was something for the aristocracy. In September 1938, Harry Oppenheimer, Ernest's son, then 29 years old, flew from Johannesburg to New York. He met with Gerald M. Lauck, president of the advertising agency N.W. Ayer and Son. The pitch was straightforward. De Beers needed Americans to want diamonds, not out of necessity, out of desire, out of social obligation, out of love. Ayer took the challenge. And what it produced in the years that followed wasn't advertising. It was cultural engineering. The agency began by mapping American consumer behavior. One of the most important discoveries was an uncomfortable one. When women participated in choosing the ring, they tended to prefer cheaper options. The solution was to transfer purchasing power to men, presented in the campaigns as the ones responsible for the decision, and therefore the targets of the message about how much to spend. Men, according to Ayer's logic, were less cautious consumers when it came to proving love. The ads that followed didn't sell stones, they sold identity. The agency bought space in magazines like Vogue, Life, Harper's Bazaar, and Saturday Evening Post, publications that shaped the tastes of middle-class America, and filled them with reproductions of paintings by Picasso, Dalí, and Derain. The subliminal message was precise. Diamonds are art. Art has no price. Trying to save money on a diamond is trying to save money on the love you feel. Ayer organized a service called Hollywood Personalities, a public relations operation that fed 125 of the country's top newspapers with stories about which diamonds movie stars received when they were proposed to. These weren't news items. They were carefully constructed narratives designed to make the diamond ring seem inevitable, natural, universal. The agency commissioned lectures in high schools across the country, reaching thousands of young people in assemblies, classes, and informal gatherings. The generation that grew up with those stories would be the one that bought the rings. By 1941, 3 years into the campaign, N.W. Ayer reported a 55% increase in diamond sales in the United States. But the biggest moment was still to come. In 1947, a copywriter named Frances Garrity was wrapping up a long night of work. She needed a slogan that captured everything the campaign was trying to say: the permanence, the love, the timeless value of a stone. Exhausted, nearly asleep at her desk, she scrawled 4 words on a piece of paper. Her colleagues hesitated. The grammar was strange. Forever implies something might not be. But Garrity insisted. The slogan debuted in 1948. It never left circulation. It ran for 75 uninterrupted years. In 1999, Advertising Age named it the best advertising slogan of the 20th century, not of an industry, of the entire century. What no one mentioned at the awards ceremony was what the slogan actually meant. A diamond is forever was not a declaration about love. It was an economic instruction disguised as poetry. Because if a diamond lasts forever, you don't resell it. Ever. And if no one resells diamonds, the secondary market doesn't exist. And if the secondary market doesn't exist, De Beers never has to compete with its own used products. Supply remains controlled. Prices remain high. The monopoly remains intact. The resale value of a diamond was typically 50% of the original retail price. Did consumers know that? No, because the campaign had built an emotional barrier so effective that the idea of selling an engagement ring was culturally equivalent to selling the marriage itself. The stone that lasts forever could not be bargained away. It was sacred, and that sacredness was worth billions of dollars a year to De Beers. But the system had a structural flaw, and the company had known it from the beginning. Diamonds aren't rare. They're one of the most common precious stones on Earth. The scarcity that sustained prices was manufactured, a direct product of the supply control exercised by De Beers. If that ever became widely known, the narrative would collapse. The entire emotional architecture built over decades of advertising depended on consumers never asking the obvious question: why does this stone cost so much? The answer would have been devastating, because one company decided it would. And while De Beers was protecting that narrative in the United States, it was expanding the same playbook to the rest of the world, with cultural adaptations that reveal the sophistication and cynicism of the operation in equal measure. In Japan, in 1967, diamond engagement rings were virtually non-existent. Japanese matrimonial tradition had no place for Western jewelry. De Beers entered the market with a campaign that linked the diamond not to American romantic love, but to modernity, aspiration, and the Western lifestyle that a post-war Japanese generation desired. In 14 years, the company converted a 15-century-old tradition. By 1981, 60% of Japanese brides were receiving diamond rings. Japan would become the world's second-largest market for the jewelry, trailing only the United States. In Germany, the campaign emphasized heritage and craftsmanship. In Brazil, status and glamour. In India, ties to Bollywood. Each market received a different version of the same lie, packaged in the local aspirations of each culture. And whenever demand in established markets threatened to plateau, De Beers invented new occasions to buy. The eternity ring, for wedding anniversaries, a symbol of ongoing affection. The trilogy ring, representing the past, present, and future of a relationship. The right-hand ring, bought and worn by women as a symbol of independence. Each new piece of jewelry was a new invented need, a new emotional void filled with compressed carbon. And then there was the question of how much to spend. Before the campaign, there was no social convention defining the appropriate value of an engagement ring. De Beers introduced the concept of 1 month's salary as the suggested standard. When that number started to seem too reasonable, the company launched a campaign in the 1980s asking, "How can you make 2 months' salary last forever?" The standard became 2 months. For the Japanese market, the suggestion was 3. Different nations, different multipliers, all calculated by the same company for the same purpose. De Beers' diamond sales in the United States went from $23 million in 1939 to $2,100 million in 1979, a 100-fold increase in 40 years. Not because diamonds got better, because the perception of them was systematically rewritten by a campaign of cultural engineering without precedent in the history of marketing. And while all of this was happening, the company was committing documented crimes that its advertisements carefully ignored. Ernest Oppenheimer was accused during World War II of refusing to release industrial diamonds for the American war effort, stones needed to manufacture military equipment. The United States War Production Board concluded that the De Beers monopoly was artificially inflating prices and preventing the American government from building adequate stockpiles. Some analysts went further. They documented evidence that cartel diamonds reached Axis powers during the conflict, sustaining German arms production. The company operated for decades outside the reach of American law. Since the 1960s, The U.S. Department of Justice had been conducting antitrust investigations into De Beers, investigations the company simply ignored, because its executives refused to set foot on American soil where they could be detained. The company ran one of the world's largest markets from outside it, untouchable by any jurisdiction that threatened its structure. In 2004, after decades of evasion, De Beers finally reached an agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. It pleaded guilty to price fixing. The fine was $10 million, a figure that, for a company with billions in annual revenue, was literally the cost of doing business. 4 years later, in 2008, the company paid $295 million to settle a series of class action lawsuits. The charges were numerous: false advertising, human rights violations, conspiracy to fix and raise diamond prices, illegal monopolization of the global supply. The settlement included a formal commitment to refrain from certain conduct that violated federal and state antitrust laws. But there was something money couldn't fix. In the late 1990s, the term blood diamond entered the public vocabulary. Stones mined in conflict zones in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Angola, Liberia, were financing civil wars. Armed groups controlled mines, forced populations into slave labor, sold the stones on the international market, and used the money to buy weapons. The chain that ended in an engagement ring passed through amputations, massacres, and forced labor camps. De Beers denied responsibility for years. The Kimberley Process, an international agreement created in 2003 to certify conflict-free diamonds, was presented as the solution. But human rights organizations documented repeatedly that the certification system had gaps wide enough for conflict diamonds to keep circulating with legitimate certificates. During that same period, the monopoly was beginning to crack from within. Rio Tinto, operator of the Argyle mine in Australia, then the world's largest diamond mine by volume, producing more than 40 million carats per year, decided to sell its production outside De Beers' channel. Canadian producers did the same. Alrosa, the Russian diamond producer, ended its supply relationship with De Beers in 2009. In July 2000, the company announced the end of 70 years of supply management, a euphemism for monopolistic pricing, and reduced its strategic stockpile of rough diamonds from $3.9 billion to $2.5 billion. Market control, which had reached 90% at its peak, fell to 63% in 2000, and kept falling. In 2018, De Beers launched Lightbox, its own lab-grown diamond brand, priced at $800 per carat regardless of size or quality. The strategy was clever in its contradictions. By marketing synthetic diamonds as fun rather than eternal, the company attempted to preserve the emotional value of natural diamonds while capturing a growing market of consumers unwilling to pay the price of the narrative. Lightbox was shut down in 2025. The strategy didn't work. In May 2024, Anglo, owner of 85% of De Beers, announced its intention to sell or spin off the company. The empire that Cecil Rhodes built, that Ernest Oppenheimer consolidated, that Harry Oppenheimer expanded through an advertising campaign transformed into a global matrimonial ritual, was up for sale. There's a question this story leaves hanging in the air, not about De Beers, about us. The campaign worked because it found something real: the human desire to symbolize love with a permanent object. De Beers didn't invent that desire. It instrumentalized it, directed it, priced it, and made entire generations feel ashamed of loving insufficiently, where insufficient meant spending less than 2 months' salary on a stone whose resale value would be half of what was paid. The first diamond engagement ring in history was given by Archduke Maximilian of Austria to Mary of Burgundy in 1477. 500 years later, an advertising agency hired by a South African cartel convinced the world that this aristocratic gesture was, in fact, a universal obligation. And the world believed it. Before 1940, only 10% of first-time American brides received diamond rings. By 1990, that number was 80%. In a single generation, De Beers rewrote what it means to propose marriage. This is not a marketing case study. It's a case study in how private power rewrites collective reality, without votes, without debate, without any form of democratic consent. One company decided what love should look like, and charged for it for 100 years. Every generation has its own versions of this story. The names change. The logic of manufacturing scarcity, of creating need where none existed, of turning desire into cultural obligation. That logic doesn't age. If you want to keep understanding how that mechanism operates in the world we live in, subscribe to the channel. Every episode is a piece of the same puzzle. Hit like if this story changed the way you look at the ring on someone's finger. And tell me in the comments, what product are you buying today that you think was built with the same kind of engineering?